we are on the cusp of an historic kind of achievement for American socialism. This has been a kind of persistent problem for the left, really you could argue for the last 150 years. Once you allow in like illiberal authoritarian radicals, they will take over unless they are purged. You don't care about Palestinians. If you cared about Palestinians, the first people you would blame for October 7th would be the party that started the war. They want to recreate the Islamic Empire, the Caliphate of the 8th century. That's what their program is, and they say it explicitly. Oftentimes, when you see somebody saying, this is an anti-war demonstration, it's not an anti-war demonstration at all. They love war. They just are on the other side.
Hello, welcome back to the Brendan O'Neill Show with me, Brendan O'Neill, and my special guest this week, Eli Lake. Eli, welcome to the show.
It's great to be here, Brendan. I've been a big fan for a while. I love what you're doing at Spiked.
Oh, thank you. And straight back at you. I'm a keen follower of everything that you write for the Free Press. And some listeners will be familiar with your writing there, and of course in many other places too, and with your Free Press podcast, Breaking History. So who better to talk about America with than you, and especially recent events that are going on in the US and that I think will probably have an impact not only in America, but potentially around the world as well. I want to start off by asking you about Mamdani in New York. It looks like a dead cert that he's going to become the mayor. That is put in the wind up a lot of people, including a lot of Jews in New York and Jewish friends of mine here in the UK as well. Is obviously thrilling the left on both sides of the Atlantic. They think this is finally a victory, a kind of creep into power after many years of losing. Give us a sense of how you see the Mamdani phenomenon. Is it good? Is it bad? What's your take on it?
Well, that's a great question. One of the big differences between America and UK politics is that America has never had a prominent socialist party. We've had a socialist party in America since 1901, when the railroad union organizer named Eugene V. Debs formed the American Socialist Party, but it's never taken hold the way that the UK Labour Party, which is a socialist party and has its roots in socialism, or the French equivalent. So European democracies have had socialist prime ministers and socialist governments. But America has never really had that. Now, what instead America has done is that, because it's a two-party system for the most part, is that socialist ideas have influenced various Democrats, most notably Franklin Delano Roosevelt, Lyndon Baines Johnson with his war on poverty. And that's really the way to kind of understand Zohran Mamdani. He is the apex of kind of American socialism in a way, because while you could argue that socialist ideas influenced the New Deal, you could certainly say that Bernie Sanders in 2016 came fairly close. He won 46% of the delegates necessary for the Democratic primary that year to be for the presidential nomination. There have been, Bernie Sanders is a socialist and he's a senator, and there are a handful of members of the House of Representatives, our Congress, who are socialists, most notably Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, or AOC, Rashida Tlaib. I mean, there's a handful. They call themselves the Squad. But the party of American socialism today, the Democratic Socialists of America, they've never come close, and their predecessor parties have never come anywhere near the level of power of the mayor of New York City. That's one of the really, really big jobs in America. That is a powerful position. It's a prominent position in the sense that the mayor of New York, and they're usually Democrats. Occasionally you get a Rudy Giuliani or a Michael Bloomberg, but usually they're Democrats, and they are major power brokers within the broader Democratic Party. So we are on the cusp of an historic kind of achievement for American socialism. Now, the irony, Brendan, is that this is a problem this has been a kind of persistent problem for the left, really you could argue for the last 150 years. And that is that there is a segment of the left that, hence the name Democratic Socialism, that believes that you fight for, you might say, democratization of capital, or the, workers controlling the means of production through democratic means, through persuasion, through elections, through organizing. That's the tradition of most of the kind of American socialists. But then there's another revolutionary tradition of the left, which is the Russian Revolution, or the Weather Underground, or the Cuban Revolution. What's happened is, and this is the problem that left-wing organizations face, which is that it's you can't really have the two in the same camp. So once you allow in like illiberal authoritarian radicals, they will take over unless they are purged, because they will purge the moderate pragmatic. We saw this in the Russian Revolution. Kerensky was more of a Democrat. You could argue Trotsky was more of a Democrat than Lenin, and then Stalin purges everybody, including his former supporters. And you see it kind of on a smaller scale within the American left. There was the student socialist group known as the Students for Democratic Society, SDS. These were the people in the 1960s who led the campus takeovers and, protested the Vietnam War, and were a pretty important group. In 1968, they were one of the major organizers of the anti-democratic convention protests. And then in 1969, an even more radical faction within the SDS takes over. We know them, they're known to history as the Weather Underground. They became domestic terrorists. So it's kind of a pattern. And the SDS itself represented a radical break from earlier socialists. And this is all a long way of sort of saying, um, kind of a figure in American history, largely forgotten, but he is the founder of the Democratic Socialist of America, Mayor Mamdani's party, is Michael Harrington. Harrington is kind of caught in the middle, because in 1962, he's the one that purges the SDS and the New Left from what was then the League of Industrial Democracies, which was one of the main socialism organizations in America. And that was kind of, Harrington was a major socialist, but he was against communism, and he was also, we should say, pro-Israel until he died in 1989. So that's the founder of the DSA. The problem here is that after 1962, Harrington regrets the break within the left, and he spends really the rest of his life trying to lure back the Leninists and the Marxists into kind of a big tent for a socialist party. And that was eventually what became the DSA, which is Mamdani's party in 1982. But just as it has happened historically time and again, once you let the radicals in, they're never satisfied. And so what we've seen in the DSA at the moment of its ascendance, in the period when it's, for most of its history, there are less than 10,000 members of the DSA. It is a sideshow. It's kind of a joke. After Bernie's success in 2016, its membership skyrockets. Also gets much younger. I mean, the old joke about, it was like a senior rec center or something was the Socialist Party. But now it's 20-year-olds living in Brooklyn who have, too many college degrees. So it's a much younger and vibrant party. And so in this period, as you're seeing, the rise of Bernie Sanders, although he's a fellow traveler, he's not a formal member of the DSA. He used to be a long time ago. AOC, who is a member of the DSA. So as they're getting more legitimacy and they really are influencing American politics, they're becoming more and more radical. The rise of these caucuses, they impose new kind of internal rules where it becomes much more of a Leninist kind of top-down organization. They also take insane positions when it comes to various policies. I mean, both domestic and abroad. We know them, as you and I care a great deal about Israel. The DSA pretty much celebrated the resistance, of October 7th, 2023. That forced a handful of some of the OG members to resign. Then, but, it's not just that. They recognized the fraudulent election in Venezuela. Their national program wants to get rid of the Senate and the House of Representatives and have one big federal legislature. They want to abolish the police and the prisons. I mean, this is again, more and more radical positions. And you're also seeing, she's no longer a member, we should say, but Calla Walsh, who has had quite a journey. She's like 20 years old, but she's now basically I'll use maybe it's an obscure reference for your audience, but she's like the American 21st century version of Ulrike Meinhof. She's somebody who has now openly calling for, resistance to Zionism worldwide, meaning she endorsed the killing of the two Israeli diplomats at the Capitol Jewish Museum this spring, a horrific event, and she recently was said anyway. She used to be a member of the DSA. She has since left the DSA. My point is that this is becoming an increasingly insane kind of revolutionary organization at the very moment it has achieved more power through electoral politics than any socialist has seen for, as again, 124 years. Now, the best case scenario is that they're so crazy that they start attacking Mamdani, which is a possibility. They almost kicked AOC out of the party this year because she voted for Iron Dome, the Israeli missile defense system, in Congress. Okay, I'm not so sure. I think Mamdani himself is a radical. He has said that he joined the DSA because it was the only political organization when he joined it that supported the boycotting and sanction of Israel. He won't condemn the phrase globalize the intifada, which is a call for terror against Jews. He, he's met with a radical imam and had his photograph taken with him, who was a character witness for the blind sheikh responsible for the 1993 World Trade Center bombing, and on and on and on. So Mamdani, he's budged on some issues. He says he's going to retain a popular police commissioner named Jessica Tisch. I don't think this should even be counted as a concession. He has said things like, I'm not going to have a Zionism litmus test for my administration, so there'll be anti-Zionist and Zionists. But even things like that are too much for the kind of party, which is what I get into in this episode. But so that's where we're at. And so the question then becomes, well, all right, it's possible the DSA will kind of flame out. They are not prepared for political power and the compromise that will require. But another possibility is that so many prominent Democrats have now endorsed Mamdani that will he make the Democratic Party itself more radical, which it's kind of leaning towards anyway. And I think that's probably the more likely scenario.
Britain's Online Safety Act is actually worse than many of us feared. Even Spite has now been ensnared by it. Our brilliant new documentary, Think Before You Post, which is all about the rise of censorship in the UK, has itself now been censored for some users in the UK. Thankfully, a solution to these problems is at hand with the help of our partners at Private Internet Access, or PIA for short. PIA is the VPN I use and trust. In case you don't know, a VPN, or virtual private network, is an app that hides your IP address and safeguards your internet connection through an encrypted tunnel. Whenever you're browsing online on an unprotected device, your device is transmitting a lot of information out into the open, which can be seen by multiple parties before it reaches the website you're trying to visit. Instead of giving away your personal information and your location to the world, PIA lets you change your IP address to one of 91 countries. This means you can gain access to websites and services that are only available in those locations. And it's not just that. Did you know that streaming services like Netflix and Prime Video have huge catalogs of content, but you can only access a fraction of it from your own country? Using PIA to change your location opens up a whole new world of streaming. I love it. Paying for Netflix without using PIA is a bit like paying for front row seats at the cinema, but being forced to sit in the hallway. I also use it all the time when I'm traveling to catch up with what's going on at home. Because PIA is available for all platforms, I never need to worry about my safety or my privacy. It works on Windows, Apple Macs, iPhones, Androids, and more. Even better, you only need one subscription to protect yourself across all the devices you own. So sign up now to the world's most transparent VPN provider and take advantage of our special offer. Viewers of my show can get 86% off a subscription to Private Internet Access. So that's just £1.67 a month. And you also get an extra 4 months thrown in completely for free. To take advantage of this incredible deal, just go to piavpn.com/Brendan. That's piavpn.com/Brendan. Brendan. Signing up is totally risk-free. There's a 30-day money-back guarantee and 24/7 customer support. You won't regret it. Sign up now at piavpn.com/Brendan. That's a really useful overview, and of course, people should listen to your podcast on the history of the American left, the radical left in America, and what Mamdani says about all of that. But one thing I wanted to ask you was what this socialism is. I mean, you've given a good overview there of the kind of radical nature and the crazy nature of some of their positions, which will not go down well with many ordinary working Americans. I'm sure they think they're nuts. Um, but what is this socialism? You said in passing, you mentioned overeducated kids in Brooklyn, and it got me thinking about what now passes for socialism in the UK as well, because I'm old enough to remember when socialism meant primarily working people going on strike, fighting for better pay, fighting for better conditions, being represented sometimes well, sometimes not so well by trade unions. And we had the miners' strike in the 1980s, and there were real pitched battles between workers who considered themselves socialist and a state that didn't want to give an inch to their demands. So that's kind of what people thought of as socialism for a long time. But it seems to me that Mamdani and these Brooklyn kids and maybe many of the members of the DSA, don't know, you can tell me, it seems to me that they're quite similar to the kind of Corbynistas here in Britain who followed Jeremy Corbyn and who are now lining up behind a new party called Your Party, very strange name for a political party, um, by which I mean they are largely the credential sections of mostly young society. They've got at least one degree, often more. They think men can become women. They think Israel is the most evil state that ever existed. They think the police are scum and they want to abolish them in certain instances, although that rallying cry doesn't have as much purchase in Britain as it does amongst radicals in America. So are we talking about socialism as it was once understood? Or are we talking about a more kind of bourgeois phenomenon that perhaps wears the clothing of socialism to pursue some crazy ideas?
Okay, well, I mean, this is the problem with the word socialism, which is
Yeah.
that it means actually both, and historically, it has meant both. Che Guevara was considered himself a socialist. So did Martin Luther King. So yes, to both. Like, socialism can mean simply, and I come from the center right, but I will say that if you're looking at the world in 1905 and you're seeing that there are no rights to organize for, to form a union, and the workers are terribly exploited and children are forced to work in factories, and you see this incredible disparity of wealth, it's totally fair. The socialist critique of that, in my view, is reasonable and correct. I don't necessarily agree with their solutions there, but I also would absolutely say that if you mean by socialism simply that you are fighting for, to use a kind of a British concept of positive rights for lots of people, and you worry about the poor and you believe in a social safety net, well, that sounds fine. And if you are committed to pursuing those goals, through, debate, campaigning, and, not just nonviolent, but you're committed to, working within a political system and respecting discourse and respecting that there will be opposition parties. Not everybody will agree with you, that there will have to be compromise. That's fine. And in some ways, that is in many ways the history of the Labor Party in your country, right? I mean, I have many problems with the Party over the years, and you can find individual MPs from Labor that sound like lunatics. But for the most part, the Labor Party, worked within the system and achieved a level of kind of a welfare state, that, was a compromise, that, it didn't eliminate capitalism in the UK, but it softened capitalism. So that's what we might call the Western, that's social democrats. Then there's the socialism of, I don't know, the FLN in Algeria or the Cuban Revolution, or for that matter, Lenin and Trotsky and Stalin called themselves socialist, even though they were, bringing about communism. So this is the problem, that socialism can mean both, which is one of the reasons why there's always been this tension. Now, to get what you're getting at, which is, a lot of the socialists in America and the UK today don't come from the working class, don't work with their hands, and really don't know anything about physical labor. That is absolutely true. They are what some people might call them knowledge workers. They're usually over-credentialed. They have degrees from prestigious universities where this kind of ideology is, pervasive. And they have seen, because of changes in our economy, and we'll see more of it, by the way, with the, kind of AI, which is going to replace a lot of jobs in the knowledge sector. They've seen there has been a little bit of a break for them, which is that the old formula, at least in America, and I think it was also true in the UK, you get your college degree, you go to a good school, you study something, and you will have a middle class life or better. What a lot of people are seeing is, wait a second, I have, 2 degrees from, Bard College in Sarah Lawrence, and I'm here in New York, and I'm 35 years old, and I still have 3 roommates, and I'm living, in a rundown place, in, deep Brooklyn, and takes me an hour and a half to get to my crappy job in Manhattan, and there's no security, and I, have really bad health insurance. What happened? Why am I not getting what the equivalent of my parents would have gotten with the degrees that I have? So that's a fair kind of question and has led many to embrace this kind of revolutionary sounding. I think it's cosplay revolution, by the way. I think most of these kids would not have the stones to really go underground and put their life on the line and, commit to kind of a revolutionary cause in the way that other radicals have, but it's glamorous for them. I mean, and so we've seen this in the mood now for at least a decade, if not more. I mean, just to give an example, one of the things that we saw in the Black Lives Matter movement, which is certainly adjacent to this, I think, is they would say, I learned it. I think the phrase is, I learned it from Asada, meaning Asada Shakur. Asada Shakur was a real revolutionary. Her first name was Joanne Chesimard. And she fled the United States after being broken out of prison because she was wanted and she was involved in a murder of a police officer, a New Jersey state trooper. So she lived in exile. So that's like valorizing literally a criminal outlaw who committed a heinous crime. And so that sort of thing is that these are our new heroes, and I really wouldn't be surprised if you start seeing, the revival of the reputations of the Weather Underground, people like Bernardine Dorn and Bill Ayers, which used to be let me just to give you a sense. In 2008, when Barack Obama won the presidential election, his association early in his career with Bill Ayers and Bernardine Dorn was toxic enough that it was a real campaign issue. And there were lots of Democrats in the primary who tried to attack him for that when he was running against Hillary Clinton. I wonder if today that would even be a scandal for Democratic Party voters. So that's where I think what you're seeing is that a lot of, and by the way, the other thing that's really interesting, I didn't get into this in the podcast, Brendan. The American unions that represent the blue collar trades, like the United Auto Workers, for example, has been pretty much taken over by this class of knowledge workers. So in our country, I don't know if it's true in the UK, there's a union for graduate students, and they're now affiliated with the auto workers, which, I mean, that makes zero sense to me. I don't think that their economic interests are aligned in any way. I think that they are completely coming from like different cultural pockets of America, but they're in the same union. And that's why the UAW puts out, these ridiculous statements about, global, I don't know, like, long live Palestine or whatever. It's because of this kind of march through the institutions. These unions, have been taken over, at least in the leadership level, a lot of the times by people who don't identify with, what they have to do for their jobs.
That's really interesting. And it's interesting to hear you say that there's this glamorizing of past criminals slash revolutionaries. I think we're probably seeing something similar in certain parts of Europe. You mentioned Baader-Meinhof earlier, and there is, if not a glamorization of Baader-Meinhof gang, there is certainly a kind of growing sympathy for them, or a sympathetic depiction of them in culture, in
Although, but we
movies.
should say that's not exactly new. I don't know about
No.
you. One of my favorite bands is The Clash. Um, do you love The Clash?
Yeah, I love the
The,
Clash.
the only band that matters. I mean, just they're the first three albums are perfect in my view. Um, but Joe Strummer, the leader of The Clash, used to wear the Red Army Faction
Yeah.
T-shirt in his concerts. Marianne Faithfull recorded a song like dedicated to Ulrika Meinhof. There was a lot of that going on in the '70s and the early '80s. It's unfortunate that if you have a center right perspective, if you're a classical small L liberal, that you really do have to separate the art from the artist.
Yeah. Yeah, oh, absolutely. Yeah. I think you've given a good description there of who these new socialists are and what they represent and the fact that they don't work with their hands and so on and so forth. That they're a kind of very interesting breed of people. And I think you're absolutely right that there is this kind of sense of arrested development among that layer of society. We have the exact same thing in big cities in the UK where you have 35-year-olds who have got PhDs who come from nice middle class backgrounds. We say middle class, but we mean upper class when we say middle class. Um, and who can't get what their parents got. They can't get on the property ladder. They don't feel able to start a family. They don't think they have a secure job. So all of those things contribute to their swaying by so-called socialist politics or radical politics. Um, but who is Mamdani's constituency in terms of votes? I've read some conflicting things about this, and for example, I've read that a lot of his votes come from well-to-do white people in New York, but he also gets votes from new arrivals in New York. I think people who are immigrants from overseas, so not kind of second or third or fourth generation immigrants, but new arrivals. It seems to be a mixed bag of people, not necessarily the workers of New York City, but a kind of strange alliance of different groups. Is that right?
Yeah, not the workers, but the shirkers of New York City, so to speak. I think that we have a term in the US, limousine liberal, which is that there is a, and by the way, this is I mean, it's an irony of sorts, but if you look at the biographies of some of the leading figures of the global left, what you find is that many of them, I mean, the very influential anarchist Mikhail Bakunin was part of, his family was part of the Romanov court. He grew up with like 100 or 200 servants, and Vladimir Lenin grew up pretty comfortably, in the sense that he studied in law school, and he came from a well-to-do family that could sort of provide for him for this advanced education. Um, you know, Osama bin Laden, which is not he's not a socialist, he's an Islamist, but he came from a very powerful and wealthy family. This is a pattern. Ulrika Meinhof herself, even though she was born into her parents died before she was 17, but she had achieved great intellectual success before she decided to join an underground terrorist group. Bernadine Dorn, her father, I believe, was on the board of Con Edison. So there's a long history of what we would call limousine liberals or limousine radicals that are people who grew up in the upper classes and decided that they wanted to kind of join a movement, a revolutionary movement. That happens all the time. And there are a lot of them live in New York City. And that's because, we live in a great free market country, and you can make a lot of money if you have a kind of creative genius. And, that you don't necessarily have to there isn't that kind of class solidarity necessarily. And so that there are a lot of New Yorkers who fit that description. I think that the kind of cadres, the door knockers for Mamdani are the Democratic Socialists. A lot of them live in Brooklyn, a lot of them, and they are the overeducated kind of class that we were talking about. I don't know whether the immigrant I'm somewhat skeptical, I should say, about how many immigrants necessarily vote. I think legal immigrants who come to the United States usually come here because it is a free market country, and they come to the country because they love America. They want to live here. That I think is still true. But there are people who also move to this country, like Mamdani's father, who grew up in Uganda, who teaches at Columbia University, and he obviously hates America. You can tell from his writings. And, I guess in his latest book, apparently, I haven't read his latest book yet. I don't know that I necessarily will, but I read a review of it. He praises Idi Amin, or, sort of makes excuses for him. So we'll see. And the other thing is that the polling looks like Mamdani, as you say, he's a near certain lock to win. I would certainly bet on it. I wrote my script for my podcast with the assumption that he would be the next mayor, but he's had a rough week politically in that he told some story about his aunt wearing a hijab after 9/11 and like was attacked for that. And it turned out he wasn't talking about his actual biological aunt, but he called a second cousin of his father aunt. And it's like it looked like a classic kind of lie, and I am aware that different cultures sometimes use aunt and uncle to refer to people who are not biologically aunts and uncles, but I think, he was caught in a fib, and that may hurt him, and also there's a lot of concern that, he can't, like, bring himself to just say outright, "Hamas should disarm." Now, he said in the debate, "Of course Hamas should disarm, and so should Israel." Like, but like that's actually saying you don't really believe that because if Israel disarms, then it's curtains for them. Whereas Hamas disarms, then there will be an incredible amount of international aid to redevelop Gaza. But so I don't know. I mean, I still think he's going to win, but I don't necessarily. I think there's just a lot of, and also the immigrants in New York City often, they have to have jobs. I mean, when you have a party or you in the past, Mamdani has, been absolutely vicious when it comes to his criticisms of the New York Police Department. A lot of immigrants live in unsafe neighborhoods and they want more policing. So I am not entirely sure that he's going to be getting that. I think there will be a segment of some who will support him. Certainly, there are a lot of Muslims who live in New York now, and they may support him because he is so openly, talks about his faith in a and he's charismatic. So we'll see. But again, I make a distinction between legal and illegal immigrants, and I think that the legal immigrants, I've always thought are a natural constituency for a politics of the free market.
Yeah, yeah, I think that's a accurate reading. I must say, if there was an upset and Mamdani didn't win, that would be very amusing. I would like
Yes.
to see that. That would be
Well,
fun.
please.
Um, a couple more things on Mamdani because it's very interesting and it's one of those American political developments that is making waves here in Europe as well. Lots of people are talking about what's happening in New York City. Um, Say a little bit about the role that anti-Israel politics plays in all of this, because some of the stuff I've seen from Mamdani is pretty scary to someone like me who's pro-Israel. You said that, as you said, he's refused to condemn the phrase "globalize the intifada," which is a call, I think, for violence against Jewish people. There's a clip doing the rounds of him very recently saying that when the NYPD puts its boot on someone's neck, that boot was laced by the IDF. That kind of anti-Semitic conspiracy theory that the IDF is training American police forces to oppress minorities. That's been doing the rounds for some time. And he's clearly incredibly anti-Israel. And someone wrote a really interesting piece. I can't remember who it was now. Maybe it was you, but someone wrote an interesting piece saying that Mamdani is essentially the 7th of October candidate in New York, which
I
by
do. I
which
wish I don't. I know the piece you're talking about. I did not write that, but
yeah.
I think
It
that's
was a
right.
it was a really interesting piece, and the point wasn't that Mamdani is going to carry out a 7th of October in New York or anything like that, but it was mainly making the point that he has unquestionably got a sense of momentum from the events of 7th of October, and more importantly, from the meltdown in the West that those events caused in terms of the growth of that Israelophobic hysteria, the left reorganizing itself around the politics of intifada, that kind of hipster intifada that we've seen sweeping the Western world. And he seems to me pretty unquestionable that he's been energized by that. So, say a little bit about the role you think hating Israel plays in all of this, and how worried should we be that the next mayor of New York might be someone who got there in large part because he hates the Jewish state?
Well, I would slightly disagree with that because I do think that he benefited enormously from just a terrible field. I mean, like the incumbent mayor, Eric Adams, was a disaster. He was indicted and he cut a deal with the Trump Justice Department. for corruption. And then Andrew Cuomo is just such an unpopular figure after his own mismanagement of New York State because he was the governor during COVID. I mean, he's responsible for this horrible policy of sending, um, you know, senior citizens infected with COVID back into nursing homes where they would infect others, over the objections, I might add, of like nurses and others who said you can't do that. Um, so in that respect, you know, Mamdani lucked out in much the same way I would say that, the fact that Trump in 2016 in the Republican primary had the good fortune of going up against a very crowded field so that there wasn't like a one lane kind of establishment candidate. Instead, he could, it was divided between all of these other kind of establishment Republicans. My view is that Mamdani was able to sort of win that Democratic primary in June because he was, had the advantage of having a very crowded field. And there was, largely, most voters did not know his full biography or much about the Democratic Socialist of America. So I think while there was certainly support from a really dedicated minority, a faction that was willing to volunteer and to do a lot of like kind of work to get out the vote, who were definitely motivated by October 7th and this kind of new hipster solidarity with Islamic fascists. There was another sense of just a lot of New Yorkers were like, you know what, like let's give this new guy a try, and let's give him credit. He's a very charismatic politician. He's smooth. He has a great smile. He's young. He exudes energy. So in that kind of environment, I think that people were either didn't know or were willing to overlook, uh, some of his radicalism, because he was a fresh break with a kind of geriatric New York Democratic Party establishment that had failed the city. And so that was he had the great benefit of timing in that respect as well.
Yeah. Yeah, that's very well put, and I think very fair. Broadening out a little bit, I wanted to ask you about the Islamo left. You wrote recently about the curious alliance between leftists, pro-trans, gender fluid,
Right.
very woke leftists on one side, and then these kind of insane Islamists on the other, and the unholy union between them.
Yes.
It's good to know that that's a problem in America as well as in the UK, because it really is a problem in Britain. And at the weekend, we saw a march in East London of essentially masked radical Muslims alongside leftists. They were chanting about Zionist scum. They said Zionist scum off our streets. They were saying from the river to the sea. I mean, it was one of the clearest displays of the Islamo-left alliance that we've seen ever, I would say, in Britain. Um, this is in a part of East London where Jews used to live, but they no longer do, and it seems pretty fair to say it's not a particularly safe place for them to go anymore. How pronounced is that problem, that alliance in America? Is it a central part of the so-called new radical left? Is there a general sense of sympathy amongst these people for groups like Hamas? How deep does this kind of unholy, unhappy union go?
Well, to answer the first part of that question, the last part first. This is in some ways is nothing new. We saw the emergence of what sometimes is called the Red Green Alliance, with the 1979 Islamic Revolution in Iran. A prominent, important intellectual, Michel Foucault, uh, the French postmodernist, was absolutely just enraptured by the rise of Ayatollah Ali Khamenei. And he was a correspondent for an Italian newspaper, uh, and covered the revolution like in glowing terms. And at one point, criticized feminists who had problems with like which by the way we know what happened after the '79 revolution mandate of the hijab. A woman's testimony in court was not worth as much as a man. The state encouraged women to stay home. I mean, it was absolutely medieval. negating many of the gains that were made in Iran for feminism. Anyway, you had people like Foucault making excuses for that in the moment. And you also saw the same in terms of British progressive politicians and Americans. Now, at the time, I blame them. Anybody could have looked up the writings of Khomeini in 1979 and realized that this is somebody who was absolutely a liberal, authoritarian and a fanatic. But at the same time, he was replacing, um, the Pahlavi regime, which, was corrupt, was had its own problems in terms of torturing dissidents in the opposition and jailing its opposition. So I can understand, like, okay, well, Khomeini's against, you know, this, authoritarian American client. So why that sounds good to me. What is inexcusable is that everybody now can see for themselves the immense damage that the 1979 revolution has done to Iran. And it's not a mystery as to why there was so much damage. It's not because of sanctions. It's not because of, it's because of the ideology of the 1979 revolution, which is this Islamist ideology, which goes back really to the early 20th century and Hassan al-Banna and the Muslim Brotherhood. So today, I don't understand it because it's not like there are not at least some Palestinians who reject Hamas. We saw that after the ceasefire kind of came into effect a month ago, the first thing Hamas started doing is going house to house and shooting their opponents, who they claimed were collaborators, in the street, literally going door to door and making sure that the executions, no trial, of course, would be seen by everybody. Now, that is despicable and not a peep from the Ceasefire Now crowd. In fact, what's amazing is that the Ceasefire Now crowd criticized the ceasefire because they wanted Hamas to win. So it's very important that they play around with language. And I think, the listeners of this podcast should realize that oftentimes when you see somebody saying this is an anti-war demonstration, it's not an anti-war demonstration at all. They love war. They just are on the other side. So that's a really important thing to kind of get out there. Now, I do not understand the appeal of political Islam. That is, by the way, different. I think we have to always say political Islam or Islamism, or I love the term from Christopher Hitchens, the late great Christopher Hitchens, Islamo-fascism. I think that's great. Um, that's not the same as Islam. Islam is a very old ancient religion. It has a lot of different versions of it. You can find Islamic thinkers that are much more accommodating of liberalism. It's not so you should get away from sort of characterizing all Muslims a certain way. The other thing to always remember about this, I'd say, and this is really where the politics of the Red Green Alliance utterly fail, because the emotional appeal is, I want to do something about these poor Palestinians and Gazans who are being bombed and starved, and I'm just a humanitarian. I'm sticking up for the underdog. But if you really think about it, who are the first victims of the Islamists? It's the Palestinians. It's other Muslims. That is always the case, whether it's ISIS, whether it's Hezbollah, whether it's the Iranian regime, whether it's, or whether it's Hamas. And so that's the other thing, is that I don't think this is an argument that's made enough. And I'm part of the problem is that I think on our side of the debate, there are a lot of people who are smuggling in a kind of anti-Islamic bigotry. But the point to make is that you people who claim to be speaking for Palestinian are just a bunch of frauds. You don't care about Palestinians. If you cared about Palestinians, the first people you would blame for October 7th would be the party that started the war with zero democratic input or consent from the people of Gaza, and then built an entire, military structure underneath and behind and in between all of the civilian infrastructure of Gaza, and didn't wear uniforms and made sure to use the actual population they're supposed to be governing as human shields. That is utterly despicable. Now, that doesn't mean, by the way, that Israel is blameless, or that, you can criticize Israel. It's a state. That's not the point. The point is that if you have erased any culpability from the people who started the war for the war, not only are you, engaged in a lie, you're doing a great disservice to Palestinians. What you're saying is that the spokesmen, the people who represent the the people of Gaza are actually their tormentors, the people who are perfectly willing to see tens of thousands of them die in order to advance what I might add is a cause of a kind of Islamic imperialism. The end state for Hamas is not a binational democratic state where Palestinians and Jews have equal rights between the river and the sea. That's a bunch of claptrap. They want to recreate the Islamic Empire, the Caliphate of the 8th century. That's what their program is, and they say it explicitly, and there's no excuse at this point. If you don't know that, you're an ignoramus. And probably, I suspect a lot of these leaders, like Jeremy Corbyn, probably do know that, which makes them worse than an ignoramus or a fool. It makes them a liar. So I think you're absolutely right to sort of point out this red-green alliance, and I do think that there is a kind of opening, because I think a lot of college students, obviously, younger people don't know as much, and there's an opportunity maybe to sort of say, wait a second, you want to help the Palestinians? The first thing you have to do is figure out a way to get rid of Hamas. And, you know, I hope that that is an argument that will be effective. But, you're right. In the last 2 years, it hasn't been effective.
I've developed this annoying habit of always doing pro-Palestinian in quote marks because
Absolutely. No, it's
if you
true.
were
Yeah.
yeah, if you were pro-Palestinian, as I consider myself to be, in the sense that I want them to live in peace and security, then you would support the destruction of Hamas, which is the albatross around the people of Gaza's neck. In relation to, I think, one thing that's always very interesting to me is the kind of double racism of the anti-Israel movement. So there's I would say the racism of their myopic obsession with the Jewish nation, not just their criticism of the state of Israel, which, as you say, is a perfectly legitimate thing to do. All states are open to criticism, but this kind of feverish, myopic, destructive obsession with Israel, which I think is a species of bigotry. And then there's also the racism of their infantilization of Palestine, where even Hamas is seen as this blameless entity, not responsible for anything. The child of world affairs, to whom things are done rather than who do things themselves. It's kind of, on the one side, infantilizing Arab society, and then on the other side, demonizing Jewish society. And you just have this horrible mishmash of bigoted opinions coming together under the banner of so-called progress. But in relation to the ceasefire now crowd, you wrote a piece recently about, and you've just said there, how they seem a bit pissed off that the war is ending. And you've just said that it's fundamentally because they wanted Hamas to win this war. And I think that's really true. They mean it when they say, get rid of the Zionist entity from the river to the sea. They mean it. It's a lot of them don't know where the river and the sea is, etc., etc. We all know that. But a lot of them really mean it when they say they want to get rid of Israel and they wanted Hamas to win this war. But do you think there's also an element where a very significant number of activists in the Western world have reoriented to themselves around this issue? I mean, they've really developed a sense of political personality, political purpose through hating Israel, through supporting Hamas, or through posing as pro-Palestinian. They wear the clothing, they shout the slogans, they boycott all the right stuff. They live and breathe this issue. And is it fair to say there's going to be a crisis of legitimacy in certain sections of Western society if this war, which we all hope it does, if it finally comes to an end?
Well, I think that part of this might be explained as sort of the idea of the omnicause, in the sense that the same crowd that were putting the black square in their social media profile has now put the Palestinian flag. A few years before that, they, were talking about the climate emergency and, transgender youth medicine. I mean, there is a tendency maybe in the era of social media that, the left kind of clings to a catastrophism, and, they view the causes as existential, and this is that. So it's possible that they will then move on to whatever the next thing is going to be, which maybe, stopping the ICE raids in the United States. That's a possibility. They'll find another cause, and it'll motivate them, and it'll kind of give them the dramatic arc that their life is missing. That some of this is just like, I want to feel like I'm part of history, and the Palestinian cause did that. Now, there will also, of course, remain a hardcore group that will be dedicating their energies to whatever they can do to end the world's only Jewish state. The question I have that I raise in my podcast is like, what does like the existence of Israel have to do with nationalized health insurance? Or for that matter, I don't know, like better labor organizing rights, or you know what I mean, traditional things that socialism and socialists have cared about for, its history over the last 150 or so years. Um, and that to me is that is a question that I don't think they can answer at this point. An interesting thing, the founder of the Democratic Socialists of America, Michael Harrington, was a lifelong Zionist. And one of the things that he said when he was recruiting uh, kind of more leftist faction to form the DSA in 1982, one of the things that he would say is, you got to understand two things about the party. I understand that, you consider yourself a doctrinaire Leninist or whatever it is, he was kind of building as he's doing his retail politics. But the DSA is pro-Israel and anti-Soviet Union. Those were the two things that he said when he was recruiting people, and that was the sort of basic idea. We are for socialism in America, but we're not going to get behind, anti-American revolutionaries, and we support the state of Israel. That's an amazing journey for the DSA to have gone from that to literally chanting from the river to the sea, not in 2023, in 2017, when they first adopted the official position of BDS, or the boycott, divestment, and sanction of Israel. So I mention all that to say that there is this kind of contradiction, and you're right. It has consumed the political energies of the left in both sides of the Atlantic. I don't see what that has to do with progressivism, or really socialism, or any of the kind of things that you're supposed to be for. I certainly think it's bizarre that because they've taken over a lot of the unions in America, that you're seeing like why would the United Arab Auto Work why would the United Auto Workers in America, or the AFL-CIO, or the American teachers unions, or whatever, what do they care about Israel? Why, you know what I mean? This is the only issue that is like the litmus test, even to be part of a labor union sometimes. So that's baffling. And I do think that, you know, the way to fight it is not to make it a choice between like nativism and socialism. I think I think the way to fight it is to reach out to people and just point out those contradictions and say, all right, like you want more rights and more job security for, the nurses or whatever. Okay, fine. But what does this have to do with Israel? Why are you obsessed with that? That seems just like at the best a distraction, and if not, a kind of self-sabotage.
I miss a left-wing politics that was pro-Israel and anti-Soviet Union. That seems like a pretty solid position to stand on. If you're going to be on the left, that's a pretty good place to be. Okay, just to finish, Eli, I want to ask you, we've had a go at the left, which I always like to do. It's one of my favorite pastimes, but I did want to ask you about the right. Um, People call it the woke right. I want to ask you about that section of it in particular. And if you look at people like Nick Fuentes, you wrote a piece recently about how he's going increasingly mainstream, which is something that worries me and other people enormously. There's also figures like Tucker Carlson, who used to be quite a sensible person. I was on his Fox show a couple of times back
Yeah,
in the
me too.
day.
Me too.
And
Yeah.
yeah, and he's now gone a little bit off the rails. One thing that he was spectacularly wrong about was the idea that when Israel and Trump did their pretty precise strikes on Iran, he argued that this was going to be disastrous, World War III. It would go on for years and years and years, and that turned out not to be true. Um, what what's your reading on this right at the moment? I mean, I see them all over the internet all the time. They go viral, they pop up in my Instagram feed. It's very annoying. What's your reading on how influential are they in the public square in America? How much of an impact are they making on the minds of young people in particular?
I would say that they are the beneficiaries, in some ways, of a very illiberal tendency that we're kind of getting out of now, which was the, the tendency to censor and to deny platforms to sort of wrong think. Um, and what I would say is that uh, someone like Nick Fuentes managed to build a movement of groypers, as they're known, who, kind of they skirt this line between, no, we're just edgelords and shit posters, like we just like to offend you. And that, I call it punk rock anti-Semitism because there is a little bit of an analogy here. I mean, there's that famous interview with the Sex Pistols in, I think, '77, where they curse on the air is a huge thing. But like if you go back and watch the clip, Susie Sue is sort of in the background. She doesn't really talk in the interview, but she's wearing a swastika, or one of them is wearing a swastika. Now, did that mean that the Sex Pistols and the punks in the late '70s were Nazis or crypto Nazis? No, it did not mean that. What it meant was that their parents fought World War II, and they were looking for the most offensive possible thing they could do. And so for the generation that fought World War II, it doesn't get any more offensive than the swastika. And that's why they did it, because it was about transgression. So there's an element here where, anti-Semitism, there is a transgressive component to it, because it is, for the most part, until recently, been excised from public debates. You don't really, it's not tolerated, which I, of course, as a Jewish person, I think is a good thing. Um, but then there's another element too, which is that there has always been a nativist strain that's flirted with anti-Semitism in the American right, certainly true of the, Anglo British right and the, European right. You can find there is historical precedent there, and it appeals to people because who believe conspiracy theories, because anti-Semitism in many ways is a conspiracy theory. And if you think about it, what does it mean if you believe lots of conspiracy theories? I want to make it something very clear. That does not mean that historically there are never conspiracies. There are conspiracies. But if you kind of attribute, say nothing is as it seems, there's something behind the curtain that is manipulating events, and I am in possession of knowledge that most people do not understand, that tells you, well, but that's in some ways an acknowledgement of your powerlessness. I think that, so if you believe that there's nothing you can do because of concentrated interests that control the media and the banks and so forth, and that you're half a step away from blaming the Jews at that point. If that's what you think, and that major historical events like 9/11 were not as the official story says, then you're also acknowledging that you really don't have much agency in your life. So I think it's some ways a response to that. I mean, we have a generation that Charlie Kirk called the Lost Boys. These are men who, young men who, maybe smoke too much marijuana sometimes, or their lives are dominated by going online or very immersive video games. And that is soul decaying. And that then makes you, vulnerable, I would say, to the sort of nihilism that Fuentes is peddling. Now, the problem with Fuentes is that he's very smart. He's a really talented broadcaster, I hate to say. He puts out a very entertaining, stream on Rumble. And he's enough of a thinker where he's trying to craft this into a kind of a really loathsome political agenda, in my view. He doesn't believe that Jewish Americans can really be loyal Americans, which is a horrible thing to say. So I just would, that's what I would say about that. We'll see how far it gets him. I am, I'm very optimistic about America, and I don't think that this is a mainstream view in the Republican Party. I don't think it's a mainstream view on the right, but it's a faction of the right, and it matters a great deal now for the major influencers to either say, we don't want anything to do with this. You're not part of us. To It's very similar, by the way, a similar problem the left has to face right now with DSA, which is like, we don't want these radicals in our tent. Or will they say, all right, well, this is one point of view in a big, in the coalition that makes up the American right. And, let's hear from them. My view is that you can't deplatform them. You can't censor them. That was a terrible idea, even though I find their ideas loathsome. You have to be able to confront them. I think the best thing to do, I don't know if you saw this, Dave Smith, the libertarian comic, I suppose, had a debate with my friend and colleague at the Free Press, Coleman Hughes. That was 3.5 hours. But I'm telling you, you watch that, and what you see is a patient, rational, reasoned discussion where he goes through all of the things that Dave Smith likes to sort of his talking points and dismantles them. And I think that that's what has to happen with somebody like Fuentes. And you got to kind of keep doing it. And then and the acolytes of Fuentes and the Tucker Carlsons. You can't just, at this point, they're too much of a faction. So the question is not, do you give them a platform? The question is, do you challenge them when you engage them? And they should. It should be absolutely, let's have it out. One of my intellectual heroes, John Stuart Mill, talked about the problem of dead dogmas, which is that even if when there's a consensus opinion, there is a risk that because it is not challenged, you forget the arguments and the reasons as to why you hold that opinion, and it becomes the equivalent of a prejudice. That's kind of what he said. And this is an opportunity for us who are alarmed by Fuentes not to lobby Facebook or X to ban his account, or YouTube or something like that, but rather to say, okay, Nick, please come on my show. I would like to talk to you and ask you about some of these ideas that I disagree with, and let's have it out. What do you have to say about that? That's, I think, the way we get out of it. Tucker Carlson just had Fuentes on. I've only seen some clips from it. Maybe if I watch the whole thing, there will be. But from what I saw, that was not a challenging interview. That was a tongue bath. So that's not good.
Eli, thank you very much. Thanks again to PIA VPN for sponsoring this episode. Take control of your digital life and get PIA for 86% off. Click the link in the description below or scan the QR code.